How's it going, everybody? Welcome back to the Goosenov Show. Today, we are going to be talking about belief. People are prone to falling into stupid patterns of thinking, biases, and I guess other mental traps. And you would think, oh, smart people are too smart for that. But the reality is that smart people especially can fall into the trap of being so smart that they convince themselves to believe dumb things. And I would also kind of, that's a well-known phenomenon. But I would go further and say that intelligence tends to, there's multiple types of intelligence, but some of the most common forms of intelligence, specifically people who are more gifted mathematically, or maybe more on like a left brain side of intelligence, or more localized intelligence. And you can read more about that in The Master and His Emissary, which is this book on kind of neuroscience and brain hemispheres. But the point is, mathematical, left brain intelligence, localized intelligence, whatever you want to call it. People who are better at math, I think they tend to be biased towards assuming that the model they use to understand the world is the totality of what the world actually is. So they tend to not see the forest for the trees. They tend to assume that the things they know very well are the only things that really matter. Or another way to put that is, because they know they're such experts in one area, they forget that there are huge swaths of information that exist, or like domains that exist outside of their subject matter, like expertise, and I think it's just like an expert bias. And maybe you don't even need to be mathematically very intelligent to fall into that bias, but many experts do fall into this area. And like here's one example of how this manifests. I think that, well, actually, this is kind of it's tangential, but it's not exactly this. But one thing I've noticed is a lot of professors kind of gloss over things that are very elementary, like very elementary concepts, because they figured it out, and it's so easy to them that they don't even see the concept. So I think a lot of teachers actually are not good teachers, even though they're very smart and they know the subject matter, because they gloss over a lot of this stuff. It becomes invisible to them. And you would want your teacher to be able to talk to people who don't know anything about the subject and help them understand the subject better. But I think that the people we choose to be teachers do exactly the opposite. They end up glossing over all the basic stuff that they should be teaching because they already know it. Here's one example, and this is kind of another tangential thing. I've noticed that, like, when I was taking Spanish throughout all my years in middle school and high school, it was always a native Spanish speaker. A native Spanish speaker always taught the Spanish class. And they always taught it terribly. They didn't know kind of how to really go into it. They were like it was not intuitive. But the best Spanish teacher I ever had was a guy in high school who was an American guy, not Spanish, not Mexican, who learned Spanish himself, and then he taught us because he had to go through, all the steps, and he realized what all the pitfalls were, and he was able to teach us. like, because he already walked that path. He wasn't a born expert. He wasn't raised in that culture. He figured out the path and he was able to translate it intuitively. And you could say, well, that doesn't make any sense because professors, like I would say professors, are a similar situation. Native Spanish speakers grew up in an environment of Spanish speakers. So they were kind of given that gift because, your brain naturally picks up languages. The same thing with experts. I think that some people are just naturally better equipped for certain subjects, or they have better innate mathematical abilities, which allows them to, pick things up, or better linguistic abilities, or blah, blah, blah. Some people are better naturally at things than other individuals. So those people learn in a different way than the average person. So it's the same thing, They are like the native Spanish speaker. They're going to teach things in a stupid manner because they can't relate to people who are normal. Now, going back to the original thing, experts, can oftentimes, how would you say it? Make another type of, I guess, bias or blunder in terms of how they view the world. In that, as I said, they assume that their model is complete. They assume that what they know explains everything because they're really good at it. But just in the way that professors are tend to not be great at teaching concepts, experts suck at simplifying things, but they also suck at understanding the entire world. Now, and that's kind of what I want to talk about today. Experts are not gods. Experts don't know everything. And the reality is, even the smartest human beings are pretty stupid. I mean, you got to understand, reality is full of, for lack of a better term, paradoxes. Things can be, extremely beautiful and great, but at the same time terrible. You can have people who are geniuses in ways that you cannot even imagine. They view the world so deeply, or they see dimensions that you can't even fathom. But they also make the stupidest blunders ever. Like, reality is full of these kind of twists and kind of I wouldn't say inconsistencies, but just, two things are kind of true at the same time in many senses. But the same thing is true with human beings. They can be very smart, but individually they can be very stupid. And why is that? It's because we live very short lifespans. You're born and you got a couple years to figure a bunch of stuff out, right? You got to learn how to speak. You got to learn the basics of how to do math, how to do grammar. You got to know the history. You got to know where you came from. You got to understand the culture. You got to go into the battlefield that is like social spaces and make friends. Figure things out on that front. Relationships, become an expert in certain things. And like the thing is, each of those arenas of like human activity are very complicated. Like you can assume that they aren't, but like every single thing has like levels of depth, right? Conversation skills, speaking skills, math, like anything that you think you're okay at or you're good at, like has like 50 levels to it. And if you're a creative person especially, you'll realize that there's only so much you can do in this life. You might want to, I want to surf, and I want to be a good hunter, and I want to, be a good comic artist, and I want to be a good engineer, and I want to sail, and I want to be a good mountain biker, and I want to invent things. I want to start some really cool businesses, and I want to fly planes, and I want to, fight for my country, and I want to write a book. It's like, you could try and do all that, but if you try and do a bunch of things, you're probably not going to be very good at many of them. Now, you can have some Renaissance people, but even they just focused on a couple different things. You really got to focus on only a couple things. And even then, if you're going to be an expert at more than a couple things, you got to be like a super genius. And even then, you're not going to be able to do it. Like, there's not enough time. But that's the world we live in. We live in a world where you can only be good at a couple of things, and your choices for where you decide to put your energy, how you decide to learn about reality, matter a lot. It's not like, and oftentimes I would argue that they're almost all frantic decisions. You kind of have to, ideally you'd have like 10 years to figure out, okay, well, what do I want to do with my life? You have 10 years of meditation and trying many different things, and then you finally get to be the extreme expert and dedicate another 10 years to do, to be really good at that, and then dedicate another 10 years to like execute, and you can kind of do that, but then But you also have the fact that you're aging at the same time, and you need to start a family, and ideally you would have like 50 years of your life where you're as spry as your 20-year-old self, but that's not the case. The clock is ticking, and your decisions are always going to be incomplete. They're never going to be, fully fleshed out, and you might think they are, but that's not the case. In the ideal world, you would have a philosopher who thinks 40 years on a problem, and then after those 40 years, he finally comes to the solution. But even in that case, the problem is that philosopher has tunnel vision for one specific set, which means that he's ignoring everything else, and everything else might have something to contribute to that, set of information. So even the people who are the smartest or who are the best experts at things naturally will probably always fall into the trap of, how'd you say it? Not making a perfect decision. And, I'm talking about this in terms of like a decision of like, what do you do with your life? But on a deeper level, and I'd say probably on the same, it's the same question, but like the question of what is true, or what should I believe? Which we kind of take for granted. I don't think that that's the actual default, but that's another discussion. But the question of what is true is something that experts will try to sell you the idea that that's a simple question. They'll try to sell you the idea with fake confidence or scientific sounding language that it's a trivial thing and it's been solved. But for the reason I laid out, even the person who's an expert is likely going to be missing a lot. And is probably going to be wrong as a result. But on the flip side, someone who's like really good at a bunch of things, he's not going to be very good at any of them, right? The person who's a well-traveled person, who's talked to, tens of thousands of people and had discussions with everybody across the world, and, is a politician, but is also good at science and da-da-da-da. It's like, they're probably better equipped, but still, are they going to be like an extreme expert at anything except for maybe, talking with people? Probably not. So no matter how you slice it, trusting one person to give you a clear view of this is an impossibility, I would say. So you might be thinking, if the question of what is true is so hopeless, well, then it doesn't matter. Nothing is true. But I'd say that's a dumb way of looking at it, because the only thing that exists isn't just individual human beings. Thank God that non-human entities exist. And you could say, oh, is that a spiritual thing? Well, I like looking at things from a materialistic sense and then also a spiritual sense. I think oftentimes, like, the thing is, they're kind of the same thing to an extent. I mean, that's complicated, but something that is true spiritually can also be proven materially, I would say. But like the full depth of it needs to be spiritual. Anyway, but my point is, there are non-human entities that exist. What does that mean? It means there are entities that exist that possess a sort of will or pseudo-will, and that can solve problems in the real world and can teach us useful information in the real world. What are these entities? Corporations or businesses of any sort, some sort of, like, an organization full of 1,000 people who are all making tiny micro decisions, that are moving around millions of dollars of capital. Like, that isn't just like some building. It's not just a company. It's an entity, because what is money? Money is, it's like a vote. It's like distilled labor. It's a way that human beings make decisions. It's a way that we communicate value. It's this complicated lifeblood of the computer that is our economy. So money goes into a corporation, and it's the corporation's electricity, or it's blood or whatever. It's, and you have a bunch of people making these decisions, and maybe you have a CEO or something, but ultimately, even the CEO is influenced by market forces. He's influenced by the people in the company, this, that, and the other. And all of those wills combine and result in kind of the general flow of what the company does with huge amounts of capital, and then what it actually does in the real world. Like, what does it build? What does it produce? What services does it provide? And, like, how is that any different than a human entity, right? People decide what to do with their time, and time is basically capital, right? So you're kind of like a tiny corporation yourself. Now, is that to say side note, I would say that, and this is something I should flesh out in another video, but I don't think corporations should own property. I think that human beings are the only entities that should own property, because corporations are entities, but they're pseudo entities. They're not actually really alive. They just they're like puppets. Same thing with a government, right? A government is just a giant corporation that uses force or the threat of force to get money. And I would say in an ideal government, property isn't owned by a disembodied entity. It's owned by, people, like a king or lords and blah, blah, blah. And I think that would solve a lot of problems. But that's a side thing. I think that entities should not be able to own anything, only people, but that's something else. But in an economy, that's another type of entity. That's just like a bunch of entities, in billions of people, trillions of dollars making huge decisions. Is it any one person making those decisions? No, it's a giant economy making decisions. And, it's like a giant computer. I mean, that's what the market is. The electricity is money. And, each node is a person or a company making a decision. And then ultimately, stochastically, as you go up, it's kind of like the gumball example, right? If a bunch of people are in line and they have to guess how many gumballs are in this jar, each individual is going to be really wrong. Oh, that's a 500. Oh, that's 10. Oh, that's 1,000. But if you take all of the guesses that they have, 100 people in line, take all their guesses, and you average them, the average value is going to be very accurate because, people in aggregate, have a wisdom to them. They act kind of like an entity. There's, wisdom in the crowd. But what we do see in democracies is that, the crowd can be misled, especially in a post-Bernays propaganda environment, right? If I just shovel a bunch of money and I just convince, the bottom 50% of people who are, more susceptible to propaganda, hey, I'll, do this because the other side is evil. Or if you do this, I'll give you free money, which isn't really propaganda. It's just bread and circuses. But, that doesn't work. But anyway, the point is it's a computer. It can solve problems, but if the computer is set up in stupid ways, then I think the analogy of it being like an entity kind of falls apart. It would be like saying, okay, your brain uses the most amount of energy out of any organ in your body, right? If I were to run my body like a democracy, I would give my brain the same amount of energy that I would give my feet or my liver, or my gallbladder. And how would the human, how would you live in an environment like that? I would venture to guess that you probably wouldn't be alive for very long, or you would be some weird blob. I don't know. Anyway, point is, how you set up an entity matters. And in an ideal environment, these giant conglomerations of whatever, either a market or a corporation or a company or a government, whatever, they act like people in a sense. But even beyond that, cultures act as entities. And and even deeper than that, and this is kind of from Richard Dawkins, but like the memes that propel society forward, the ideas that propagate in our minds, they act like kind of living beings as well, even though they're just kind of abstractions. It's just information, right? The way evolution works is, it's not something that's alive. It's just an algorithm. And if you know anything about evolutionary algorithms, it's just a very, very efficient optimization algorithm. I would highly recommend you look into evolutionary algorithms, but that's what kind of a meme is, or like a virus-like idea. It's something that acts alive just because the math that propels it, right? Evolution, gives it a lot of power, and ultimately, better memes survive, right? Especially memes that ensure the survival of the people who propagate them, right? Because if someone was very good at propagating a meme and then they just died, or they died before they could propagate it more, that's probably going to die out to a meme that propagates even more efficiently. So anyway, I think that there's like a coevolution. Memes help ensure survival because it allows for the propagation of itself better. Anyway, so there's a lot of different types of entities, and we ended up in memes. But that's the solution to the expert problem, I would say. That's the solution to the fact that reality is almost incomprehensible. The fact that any individual is probably not going to be able to figure things out in their own lifetime, or they're probably going to be only going to be able to figure out a couple things. But that's only if they were starting from complete first principles. But the good thing is we aren't, because we can rely on entities greater than the individual, right? In your own life, if you were trying to do everything yourself, you're not going to be able to do very much. But if you work with a team, right, kind of a bigger organism, you can do even more. Then you work with an even bigger team, like a company, then you can change the entire world. You work with a government, you change the course of history. And then if you propagate memes, like Jesus Christ, then you can, change the nature of kind of how humanity exists. I mean, so anyway, point is, the problem of life and kind of how we can influence life is solved by the existence of non-human entities. And I would say, if you are not leveraging the power of culture, the power of like ancient memes, you are setting yourself up for failure. It's as if the question is, say I wanted to play a video game and I wanted to beat it as soon as I possibly could. There's one video game where there is a save, there's a save checkpoint that's like really close to the end. And let's say I've played this video games like this a lot, so I'm already good at the basic controls. And then there's a save checkpoint, like there's no save checkpoint, someone's starting from scratch. if you start at the save checkpoint of the one that's already 90% done, that person's probably going to finish the game before the person who starts it right at the beginning. Same thing, same analogy, like a similar analogy would be like a relay race, right? If you as one person are trying to run the entire racetrack and you're running against people who are doing a relay race, you know, the people in the relay race, there's like 4 people running 1 mile versus you running that same mile. Even if you're probably the fastest person in the world, you know, you might lose. The likelihood you lose to other good runners who are just running a relay race is a lot higher. You know, you're probably not going to win, because you know they're picking up where someone else left off. Like, and that's how human beings, you know, can solve the seemingly incomprehensible world that's out there, right? Every scientist who's worth their salt says this. They say, you know, I stand on the shoulders of giants. Like, I think Newton said that. But it's like, that's how things are, right? You know, Plato and Socrates, you can read them and be like, oh, that's obvious. But it's like, it's only obvious because we've been living with the things they found out a very long time ago. And you could say, well, I never read it, so it never affected me. But it's like, the culture affects you. The culture is of this giant entity, and it you know, programs you from birth. So you're starting at a new save checkpoint, whether you like it or not. You know, people who are watching this video are likely coming from Christian countries or formerly Christian countries. And the benefit of living in such a country is that those countries come pre-installed with a bunch of Christian assumptions about the world. You know, one way of looking at it is, or one way of describing it is a guilt-based society. What is a guilt-based society? There's 2 main types of societies. Or 3, but there's only 2 that really matter. The first one is a guilt-based society, and the second one is a shame-based society, and the third one is a fear-based society. And the fourth one is anxiety, but that's kind of new. But guilt means that you feel bad about something you did, and no one else is making you feel bad. You just feel bad that you did it. Which you would assume, oh, everyone feels that. But I don't think that has actually been the case for a lot of human history. I feel like that's programmed into you to an extent. The other type, which is the more common one, is shame-based, where your community, you know, makes you feel bad about things that you did. And, you know, every society has a level of this, but like this is about the primary mode of human socialization. You know, guilt, are you keeping yourself in check? Shame, is your community keeping you in check? Fear, the only reason you act in a certain socialized way is because you are afraid of retaliation, right? I don't want to steal because someone's going to chop my arm off. You know, it's not because, you know, I want to look good in the eyes of my community. I don't care about that. I'm acting good because I don't want a rhinoceros to, you know, skewer me. You know, I don't want to get eaten by a lion. And then anxiety, I guess it's kind of a mixture of shame and guilt to an extent. But it's also, you also mix in nihilism. So it's like cancel culture. I mean, it's like, I don't want to say the wrong thing because I don't want to, because number one, it would be wrong for me to do it, you know, so it's guilt, shame, other people around me are going to get really upset at me. And then nihilism, it's like, well, there's a couple things. One, people cling to anxiety-based socialization protocols because it is a life raft against a potentially meaningless universe. Number one. So if you stop believing in that, then you're anxious because your entire worldview would collapse if you stop kind of doing that which causes you the anxiety. So it's like kind of a feedback loop, you know. But it's also anxiety. Well, yeah, I'd say that's probably that's one and two. You know, you're anxious because you need to believe in this framework. And if you stop believing in it, then it's an even worse fate. Right? But it's also it's interesting because you're believing two things at once. You're believing in a framework that is, you know, socializing you. But you also don't believe in that framework because you don't believe in anything. So the anxiety comes from the fact that you think the world is chaos. You think that nothing matters. You think that, you know, there is no rhyme or reason. So at any moment I could just get, you know, killed and there's nothing that, or something terrible can happen to me and there's no reason for it and it doesn't mean anything and it won't, like, my life will end up meaning nothing. So anyway, like that's I think what an anxiety-based socialization system is, which I think most of the West kind of is like that now. But the core Christian way of looking at it is guilt-based. You know, you're keeping yourself in check. And what we have seen over the last 200 years or so is a kind of a reaction to Christianity, an exploration of different ideas. And it all started, or the ball really started to get rolling with the founder of rationalism, so Descartes. But his main idea was, I think, therefore I am. Which, in the point of that was, he was trying to come up with a foundation that would explain all of reality. And he needed to think of, what's the base of like, what's the most, you know, irrefutable, you know, how would you say it? Like, self-reinforcing, like an idea that is just self-evidently true. And he said, I think therefore I am. And the goal of the Enlightenment and rationalism and all that was to create a new, better world order. It was basically a revolution against the old Christian way of looking at the world. Just reestablishing everything else from scratch, because we're smarter than the past, and you know we're actually doing it right. The past, it was all mythology and stupidity, but we're finally smart. We're finally smart. We finally are actually, you know, smart because we're rationalists. So let's just logically think through everything from scratch and then build the actually right ideas from scratch. That's what the Enlightenment is. But as I told you in the beginning, you can't do that. Reality is too complicated. So what you end up having is a bunch of these philosophers who are just, you know, nerds about philosophy, and they start, you know, talking in circles and coming up with these. I'm biased in this, but I think a lot of their ideas are kind of stupid, and they don't really see the end result of where they're going. But ultimately, from first principles, they try to come up with something new. Because Newton, from somewhat first principles, comes up with, you know, gravity the laws of motion, force, blah, 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 calculus. So they think, okay, well, if science is able to do all this, then we can just, keep doing that. But the reality is Newton wasn't, he even said he stands on the shoulders of giants. It might have seemed like he was coming up with all these ideas from scratch, but he was really part of a long tradition which started accelerating, in the 16 and 1700s, but had continued or was continuously going on even, well before Newton. Anyway, so we find ourselves right now in a world where the Enlightenment memes, the Enlightenment ideas have won. And I would argue, not because they're actually better, but because they were tethered to a very successful process, a very successful historical sequence of science and industrialization. Over the last 500 years, lots of low-hanging fruit has been found by tons of scientists. And some people would argue that the stuff wasn't actually low-hanging fruit. But I would say that, most of they needed to be, people who came up with these ideas needed to be very smart, and it's not exactly low-hanging fruit, but the system that we had made it very, very likely for a lot of these scientific discoveries to have been made. But you have kind of this chain reaction of scientific discoveries happening. You have industrialization. So you have the political climate allows for industrialization to happen, right? I need to look more into how industrial England, started going, but to an extent, free market economics was part of it, which was like a perfect storm. Typically you had really authoritarian governments, but in England they were, they let people be a little more free with how they did stuff. And then that kind of went even further in America, where you had Americans go to a waterfall or a river and then, put a water mill, and then they start up a lumber mill, or, they start, threading yarn, or, doing some basic processing. And because they're at the outer colonies, and because, they have just so much land and so many resources, the Americans are able to sell it for cheap. And they end up making a lot of money off of that, which they end up investing into better manufacturing. And then it, spurs this kind of new invention or a new kind of revolution in manufacturing called the American method of manufacturing, with part standardization and manufacturing you can actually trust in mass now, which is typified with American weapons manufacturing. America was founded on guns. That's what America is. And then that just exploded. America, just led manufacturing and industrialization, and then everyone else copied. And anyway, the perfect storm comes about. And I'd say most of these things are purely economic and political. Along with, I'd say, a couple ideas philosophically of reality is comprehensible, and the core truths of reality can be simplified into laws or heuristics or repeatable processes. So this actually is based on the Christian view of truth being immovable and constant and absolute. But to an extent, it also relies on like the Enlightenment idea of like we can simplify things. But it's only an element of the Enlightenment. It's not everything. The progress we've seen over the last 300 plus years is an interesting synthesis of a lot of ideas. The problem is that some people try and simplify it, right? Because it's not just any one idea. There's a lot of crazy things happening at the same time. But because the Enlightenment happens at the same time of industrialization and the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment likes to take credit for it when the process had been going on for a lot longer than the Enlightenment. So, what's the point here? The point is, today you have a lot of scientists who feel very self-assured in the belief that there is no God and, you know, it's all atoms. Everything is just an atom, especially your brain. The only reason you're conscious is because your brain is complex. And complexity creates qualia, which is a stupid idea, And you could say, well, no, that makes sense to me. But it's like, show me a system which is complex that demonstrates genuine qualia. And qualia just means like conscious experience. Now, as I said before, you can have pseudo entities. You can have things that kind of look like they're sentient, right? Like an economy. Economy is like complicated. An economy makes decisions. An economy strategizes. Same thing as a government or a company or whatever, or a meme. But are they sentient? Does an idea possess feeling? Now, from a Christian perspective, the answer might actually be yes, but I would need to look more into that. That goes into the idea of like angels and stuff, but that's another story. And I'm not making a point of, I might be completely misunderstanding some people, but some people have some interesting ideas on that. But point is, when it comes to actual like physical things, or not ideas, is a company sentient? Is an economy sentient? If you're saying that the complexity of the brain leads to qualia, then you would have to make a similar argument about just all the stars in the universe and the economy being sentient and businesses having, feelings. It's like, that's not, like, I feel like we know that that's not the case. And, maybe I could try and prove that, but I feel like that would be an entire paper on its own. We're talking high level here. But anyway, going back to the original point. Reality is complicated. You need to rely on systems greater than yourself for comprehending reality. Experts can be wrong in terrible ways. And I would say, and this is the fundamental point, today people believe in a new religion, the new religion of the Enlightenment, which is we can abandon the march of thought of human mimetic evolution, that's been happening for tens of thousands of years, and reinvent it all ourselves, right here and right now. And they assume that it will give them a more accurate view of reality than being part of that long, march of ideas. So one way of conceptualizing this is tradition versus, revolutionary progressivism or some other way of, revolutionary rationalism. That's how I would say it, right? The problem is I don't think that works. And you could say, well, no, it does work and da-da-da-da, look at all the science. But it's like, number one, science is not a product of rationalism. And you might not be convinced about that, but I would argue the reason why you're not convinced is because you're not looking at it deep enough. Because you assume way too much, which is I think a pitfall that a lot of people fall into. They don't see all of the complex beliefs that they actually have. They don't realize that their worldview is actually borrowing a lot from like tons of implicit ideas of the past. Like linear time. In Africa, like if you listen to like an African philosopher, and you've probably seen the clip floating around, but this woman says that in Africa, I think they like actually perceive time backwards, or their view of like there's maybe two versions, like one where they perceive time backwards, or the only thing that exists is the present. But different cultures perceive time in different ways. Linguistically, like, if you listen to how, and this is on a very deep level, like the linguistic patterns that different cultures use can be very interestingly different. Like if I've listened to how people who are, from India, like their linguistic patterns, like they have different ways of like setting up their sentences that display kind of a different approach to like how logic operates. Same thing with like kind of China or, what was it? Farsi, if you look at that language, or maybe even Russian, like, Russian people conceptualize, they have a slightly different conception of reality than kind of the rest of the West. Same thing with China. You can see this through their humor, right? Look at Chinese memes. Like I think Chinese and Japanese, like their humor is very funny, but it's in a different way than Western humor is. And you could say, it doesn't matter, but it's like, and that's just like kind of a top level, like a high level thing. But it's like, my point is, and I'm not really pointing at anything specific, but this is more subtle. Our cultures, the ideas that are implicit in them, the stories we tell ourselves, and everything else it isn't just like a piece of clothing that you wear. It's not just a holiday. It influences you on the deepest level possible. It influences your ideas, your being, how you conceive of yourself. And especially for people in the West, like without the ideas that you take for granted, like if you didn't have those ideas, you wouldn't be living in the same society that you're in now. And does that mean that our ideas are perfect? No. I think it just means that we can't assume that we have all the playing cards, that we have all the facts, especially as individuals. As individuals, we can be very sure about a couple things, but we can't be very sure about the entire, picture on a deep level. And I would say any movement that tries to assume that, any movement that says, like for example, like leftism and capitalism, like, and there are leftists who could say, oh, well, no, that's not actually what I believe. But it's like, at the end of the day, the view of leftism is that history is progress. You had feudalism, and then capitalism, took over that. But capitalism is like it's an evil system based on greed, and it will always lead to like a suboptimal environment. So we need the next thing, which is socialism or communism, and then that will be a better, state of being, But it's like, but that assumes that those categories even make sense. And it assumes that your conceptualization of the problem is even accurate. And someone who's debating a communist would say, actually it's wrong because this, and this. But I'd say even the debater isn't talking about it on like a sufficient depth. So anyway, my point is, you could say, well, then we can't know anything. But to the original point, the idea that I've been trying to kind of approach from many ways, we can know things, but only as members of a historical process, as members of a long line of people in a huge community that spans thousands of years, that spans millions of people, in the context of all of human history. I don't think you can just, pick up from, 1947. All right, we're just going to, pick up from this point and then, forget everything else. We're just going to pick up from this point and just assume like even if you tried to do that, you're still assuming a lot of the implicit things that came from before. So I think an attempt to destroy that, an attempt to erase the past, is both futile, and even if you tried to do it, you would be erasing not the errors of the past, or you would be erasing your understanding of reality itself. Because there's so many assumptions that if you try and sever yourself from the past, if you try and look at things from a pure lens, nothing's going to make sense. And it's just like this is just how the right brain looks at the world. It doesn't kind of run away from the complexity. It says complexity is innate. It's part of reality. As David Deutsch says, problems are inevitable. So instead of trying to, have a perfectly clean house 100% of the time, realize that, there's, the entropy, the kind of the decay, the imperfections, or that's part of how it is, right? Like reality is like a game of whack-a-mole, right? You hit one, another one's going to pop up. And I'd say that there's two approaches to that, right? There's two kind of views that can come about. You could say, well, if that's how reality is, then it's not even worth playing because truth isn't even real. Everything's relative. But I would say truth is real. Truth is comprehensible. But to put the fullness of truth in your head, right? To know every little detail about every little thing, it's like that is impossible. Because like even the smartest person is not going to be able to understand that. Which is why we need super entities like culture to help us navigate it, to help simplify it so that we can understand how the world operates. But at the same time, I think there's a cheat code. Like reality is fractal. What does that mean? You say, oh, you're just using the term fractal. It's like, which is interesting. The term fractal, I think, or the idea of fractals in mathematics came about in like the 70s. I thought it was way older, but it's like actually a relatively new thing. But fractal, meaning, a pattern at a small level can be like reflected at like a high level. The same, if I keep zooming in, the pattern is going to keep continuing on the lowest levels and at the highest levels. What does that mean for reality? I think that you can get a good enough understanding of the real world, how it operates, blah, 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 if you're an idiot or if you're really smart. The problem is neither of those are going to be complete, but they're going to be good enough. They're going to be good enough understandings. And you only get those good enough heuristics, those good enough understandings from culture, from being part of a community with multiple people, and from the chaos that brings, from the messiness that has. And here's the thesis. The point of that is sometimes the culture is going to give you ideas which at the current moment you might be uncomfortable with. At the current moment, it might feel like there's not enough evidence, or it's not a justified position, or it just doesn't make sense. But I would argue, especially if billions of people across tens of thousands of years are repeating the same points and are saying the same things, and the smartest people from all societies are making this point, it's more likely that your view of reality is wrong and you're missing a big chunk of it, or you're missing a big point, than everyone else is wrong. Now, there are some times where, most people can be wrong about something, like germ theory. But that's that's something that's like outside of our realm of experience, right? Like, human beings have been able to perceive the stars, have been able to perceive other people, have been able to perceive things kind of on our level for a long time. When you have new technologies that emerge that allow you to like perceive different dimensions of reality, right? Then you can kind of come up with like a different view of things, like with microbes. But for the most part, I would say if billions of people have thought about a problem and have utilized a certain tool set, that you're analyzing the problem with, it's likely that the solution you come to yourself might be less accurate than what everyone else is coming to. Now, the counter argument would be, well, we looked into a new dimension of reality, which is, the subatomic level. We looked at how particles operate. We looked at all this and blah, blah, blah. And we didn't find God there. And also, this rationalist view of things, it's not actually based on the idea of reinventing everything from first principles. It's based on discovering new dimensions and then using that to, fuel a different worldview, which, fair, but that's not that's not how rationalism started. Or that's not kind of, well, that's not really how it started, and that's not how it exists today. But let's synthesize these ideas. There's two things that could be true. One, all of humanity was missing something big because we didn't look at things on the subatomic level. We didn't or we didn't see other dimensions that were critical towards actually understanding what is going on in the world. Which would mean, one, reality isn't fractal because there's an incongruence between how things operate on the lowest level and how things operate on our level and how things operate on the really high level. Two, I think it would mean that heuristics don't make sense because a simplification. Actually, no. Let's go back. It's not that heuristics don't make sense. It's just that reality isn't fractal. Every different level of reality is operating under different physics, and they're different dimensions, and they have no interaction with each other. But I would argue that that's not. We see that not to be the case, because the indeterminism on the quantum level, you could say that it's only on that level, but I would argue that you can see macro manifestations of indeterminism at our level and maybe even higher. And maybe it's only through human beings, right? Like the quantum restaurant picker. If I have a quantum random number generator, 0 means I go to an Italian restaurant, and 1 means I go to a French restaurant. I click the quantum random number generator, and it chooses, a French restaurant. A quantum event affected something well beyond the subatomic level, well beyond the particle level. It affected something huge on our level, right? So people will argue that, things are indeterministic on the low levels, but on the high levels, they're always going to be very deterministic. But it's not the case, as I demonstrated. And I would say that human beings kind of probably operate on a similar level, right? Even if the world is all materialistic and there is no God and whatever, and there's no soul, I think human will probably leverages something quantum mechanical, something like the wave function collapse. I think that's how our decisions operate. What exists in front of you is like this cloud of possible things that you could do. And it requires you to will into existence a decision to choose one thing out of every possible path that you could take, which is just the wave function. So I think already, and maybe I'm wrong, but already we're familiar, or we had the tools to understand, the subatomic level. It's not a completely foreign dimension to us. And on the very high level, we could already see the stars, so that's not a foreign dimension to us. We just, came up with a better understanding of what's actually going on. But we still kind of saw it. We could still learn lessons from that. So my point is, even if the superorganism of humanity didn't really have a completely accurate view of what scientifically is going on, it still can learn lessons about core truths of the world from everything we already have been able to observe. And I would argue that science can give us a more accurate view, a more kind of refined view, but it probably will not change a lot of the fundamental breakthroughs that we've had about how reality operates on, how would you say it? like a moral level, an experiential level, and a philosophical level. Because either reality is fractal or it isn't. If it isn't fractal, then okay, then nothing matters, and it's like, well, then how do we know anything? And I don't think that's a world you want to live in. But I would also say that the data empirically, I don't think shows us that reality isn't fractal. I think it shows us that it is. Like the structure of galaxies is similar to structures we see on Earth, right? Fluid dynamics looks like kind of a galaxy spiral. The Fibonacci sequence, it's mimicked by plants, but also huge structures in the cosmos. If you look at the structure of electron orbitals, it mimics kind of how sound waves operate, like on our level, right? Like if I were to put a bunch of sand on a table, that vibrates, and if I were to play like a violin, so it like vibrates the sand is going to move in certain ways, and it's going to generate weird geometric patterns, which look very similar to like on the lowest level, because it's just like the most efficient way that matter sets itself up given certain like vibrational frequencies. And that's kind of very high level woo woo, but it's like, point is, like if you want a different tool set, if you want, well, no, you got to explain it with pure math, or you need to explain it with pure science. Like, where's the peer study? Where's the evidence? It's like there's more types of data and evidence than just an Excel spreadsheet with a bunch of numbers, right? Like, and I would say, like, looking at it from the artistic sense of like, kind of fractal patterns on multiple layers of reality, right? I might not be able to explain to you the mathematics of why it, but it's like, that there's some connection there. How is it specifically connected? You probably need to write a huge book on it, and then maybe that only chips away at a little bit. But I think fundamentally, like these observations where it's hard to really pinpoint a specific equation or something, like that tells you kind of a lot more about like what's actually going on than a simple equation. Right. And here, going back to the original point, I think experts tend to try and linearize things too much. It's useful as an individual human being. You can push forward humanity a lot more if you come up with a really good linear formula, right? Newton, is probably one of the most influential people in all of human history because he came up with a couple really good formula. So as an individual, great contributor. But there's another type of knowledge, which is kind of looking at general connections, on a metaphorical level, on a higher level, which a lot of these experts don't like, but that's kind of narrowing down how the world operates to, a playing field that isn't actually correct either way. But anyway, point is, even if humanity in general, these giant entities, have not been able to make accurate predictions on the very specific nuanced details of like, oh yeah, microorganisms cause, disease, or, everything is made up of, tiny little indeterministic particles. Even if the economy wasn't able to figure that out on its own, I think it can push us towards truths that are not purely linear, but more relational, or more kind of like telling general truths about reality. And the scientist would look at that and say, well, those don't matter. But they do. And why do they matter? I think they matter in the same way that science matters. Why does science matter? Because I can use an equation to predict something in the future. That's pretty much the only reason science matters. But the same thing comes in the opposite direction. A high-level truth that's more philosophical or spiritual or aesthetic. I think that's probably the best way to look at it. It's aesthetic. It deals with your consciousness, your qualia, your feel of how things are connected. You could say that it doesn't matter because there's no... It doesn't predict anything, but it does. Because it helps you understand what you should believe, how you should view the nature of the world. And how that fuels prediction is the people who have certain beliefs, have a, program into their minds a more accurate approach to reality. They're going to survive. And why do they survive? Probably because they are more attuned to how reality works. They're more attuned to the truth, which means even if society, culture, spirituality, whatever, doesn't use your scientific terms, it is simply using a different language to convey useful information to people, which may actually be more true than the narrow linear way that you are actually defining it. Because scientists are the kings of a small little plot of land. But reality is much more than that little plot of land. Now, so basically, my point here is, I think there's a good reason to believe in God, because I think this isn't just an idea in a vacuum, and it's not just, oh, there's a angry person in the sky. It's like, that's not what it is. That's a metaphor, but like the actual intellectual work that the supercomputer of humanity has kind of, led us towards, led us in that direction for a reason. And reality is probably fractal. Aesthetics matter. And you could just discount it, but for the reasons I described, I would say that you're probably not being very smart, and you're looking at reality too narrowly. And I would also say, science does not tell you how to live your life. It doesn't tell you what you should be doing with your day-to-day. It doesn't tell you what is good. It doesn't tell you what is bad. You need culture to help teach you that. You need more tools than you're just born with. And you could pretend like you don't need that. But the problem is, every single atheist who says, well, no, just be a good person. How do you know what a good person is? I'm going to just do whatever I want. You're going to do everything that you want. Okay. Interesting. So you're going to be like a toddler. Imagine if a toddler was 40 years old. They'd probably be put on death row. Toddlers are like sociopaths. But we tolerate them because they're cute and they're small and, they aren't harming anybody. But like, a lot of atheists, they don't realize the culture that they're in. They don't realize they take things for granted, and I'm saying you can't do that. And you also can't oversimplify how reality operates to, your own specific domain or linear information or just mathematics, because that is just a way of understanding empirical data on a specific level. And I would also say, like David Deutsch says and other physicists, like there are always going to be more problems. So if you think that you understand the totality of a subject, there's always going to be another weird twist to it. So it's like you need another approach to understanding reality, which the systems I described give you already. And it like, we don't need to overcomplicate this. Be a part of your culture, and also, be a member of the scientific community, and let all the areas of the world inform how you see reality. We don't need to tear down the past. It's better that we, build on the city that already exists, because you don't know what you're tearing down when you end up tearing down the past. And I don't know. I think at the end of the day, we just need like more humility, and less pride that we know every answer and because I don't know. You got to realize you're born into this world. You don't have much time to figure things out. And if we're going to leave the best impact we can on the world, we can't be, these weird atomized individuals. We can't pretend like, we can solve every problem ourselves. That's just, honestly, it's like a pathology. I forgot the specific thing, but it's an actual psychological phenomenon. Like when you're young, you're dependent on your parents, right? You're going to die if you don't have your parents. And then codependent or something like that. And then you slowly grow out of that and you become, independent. I'm going to do everything myself, right? I'm going to tie my shoes all by myself. I'm going to do my test all by myself. I'm going to blah, blah, blah. I'm going to drive myself to school. But then I think a lot of people get stuck at that phase. They think that they can do everything themselves. But the next step on top of that is interdependence. Not just being yourself, but being yourself in a network of other individuals. Now, there's a pathology for that too, where I'd say that you kind of become absorbed in the crowd and you stop thinking for yourself, and you kind of become possessed by these ideologies that are, these mimetic viruses that are are viruses. They're propagating because they can propagate, and then they don't care about what havoc they wreak on the world. You got to watch out for that. But you also got to watch out for the idea that you can just do everything yourself. And this is why it's so important. The spiritual side of it is so important. What is spirituality? If you read the Old Testament and the New Testament, what is it basically saying? It's saying that virtue is very important. It's saying that you can't just assume that you're a good person. It means that you are something that needs to be worked on continuously. You need to make sure that you're holding yourself accountable and becoming better. and, striving to be closer to God every single day. And what does that mean? If you're going to look at it from a materialistic sense, it means striving to be your ideal self. You're striving towards a greater ideal. You're striving towards the truth. It's like, that's why it's so important. Because if you don't, you end up falling into these weird pathologies. You end up thinking that you can solve all the problems yourself by being super independent. Or you become possessed by a mind virus, by being way too interdependent. It's like, and that's the fun of it. It's like we're living this life, and how we live the video game of our lives matters a lot. It's not like, we're not computer programs where the input matters and the output matters and blah, blah. It's like, it's like, there's a style to it. There's an aesthetic component to how you live. And that's what spirituality is. It's, is your life actually beautiful? Right? Is it, well-rounded might be one way of looking at it, but that's kind of a crude way of looking at it. It's like, is your life a beautiful one? Is it something that is an ideal? Or is it something that is, disgusting and, oversimplistic and prideful? And it's like, you can think you're above that, but it's like, if you don't, I would say, I think that just leaves you in hell. Like even in a materialistic sense, it leaves you in a horrific space, sometimes that you can't even conceptualize because you are not looking at it through the lens of virtue. And, well, and at the end of the day, reality is complex. Let's not assume that we're better than the past because we have fancy technology and science and whatever. We can see things in a much clearer way on certain dimensions, but like, the people in the past were human beings too. And there were probably smarter people in the past than there are now. But at the same time, don't assume that just because there were some great people in the past that, people today don't matter compared to like a lot of people in the past. Because I think there's another pathology. I think some people can go way too far in the other direction where they idealize the past and they say, oh, the old philosophers in the past, they came up with all the ideas and it's our job just to learn from them. Like Kant came up with all these ideas and he's the only one that matters. But I think that's wrong too. It's like, there's like billions of people around today, 8 billion or something. And, 8 billion people was probably, like 2 centuries worth of people. But now it's like, 1 century or a decade or something like that. So it's like, we might actually have some smarter people around today. So you can't discount the present either. It's like, but there's the thing. There's the fundamental point. Reality is complex. You can't just simplify it into one thing. So don't trust your stupid expertise. You can trust it maybe for some small answers, but like for everything, it's going to lead you off a bad path, right? If you're too traditionalist or if you're too kind of like conservative in that sense, right? If you idealize the past, reality can only be experienced by people in the past and they're the only ones who have all the answers. It's like, no, that's wrong. Radical revolutionary rationalism, that's also wrong. Pure spiritualism, I would argue that's probably wrong too. Pure materialism is also wrong. It's like all these simplifications are probably wrong. And it all stems from pride. It stems from the pride that you can put all of the universe into your own little brain yourself. You're basically saying you're God. And as I said before, to say that is to reject the idea that reality is fractal, but it's also at the same time contradictory, and like in a contradictory manner, to say that reality is fractal, because if it wasn't, then how would you put everything into your brain, right? If you can't simplify reality, if the same thing wasn't true at the lowest level and the highest level, if it couldn't be, reality is fractally unpacked, but it stems from core, rules. That's what a fractal is. To say that you can understand everything, right, or you're basically, or at least the current iteration is saying that we couldn't understand reality in the past because we were operating we didn't see other dimensions, right? Like we didn't see the microbe level. We didn't see the subatomic level. We didn't see how planets actually moved, and we didn't understand what stars and galaxies were. So we weren't able to generate a good view of what truth is. So that means fractal is like the fractal view of reality isn't right. But at the same time, you're also assuming that you can still compact everything into your brain to have a really good view of things that's better than everyone in the past. So it's self-contradicting, which maybe it's not. Maybe I'm misconceptualizing, but I think it is. So basically, if you are a radical rationalist today, you're probably insane. But I think the way they get around that is progressivism. It's that, Hegelian progressivism. So it's like, maybe I don't know everything, but at least I'm going to be better than those people in the past, right? Those capitalists were better than the feudalists, but I'm better than the capitalists, and I'm probably doing something terrible, but I'm at least better than the previous iteration. So it's like very reactionary, which is funny because leftists do not like reactionary stuff. But I mean, that's kind of what they're doing. And where does this lead? Like the thing is, even that leads to something insane. Assuming that it's like, let's assume that progressivism is true. It's like it gets destroyed by like reductio ad absurdum. I think that's how you say it. But like let's game theory out how progressivism goes. Okay, so capitalism, communism solves the economics, but then now we have the social level. So we got to demolish racism, sexism, classism was already demolished. But then you have like non-human things. So like animals. So it's going to be animal rights and veganism. But then it's like, well, what about just form itself? Right? That's oppressive. And then you have like extreme transhumanism, and then like, and then you start like empathizing with like rocks and matter and saying, well, now we got to turn everything conscious, or we need to give all matter the same rights and stuff. And so it either goes into weird animism, or it goes into like hyper transhumanism, where you try and like upload your mind into rocks, and like basically it's like the singularity theory. So I guess where that goes is like one way of looking at it, and this is like very high level. Like it gets bizarre because it is bizarre. It's like they would say that, okay, you'd have the singularity where you'd be able to, turn everything into the most like dense computer possible, like computronium. Like let's say you have like an atom that is able to be like its own computer, And now the goal is to turn the entire universe into this computronium because it makes everything equal, everything's on the same level, and there is no difference, and everything's homogeneous and, great because it's all equal or whatever. And that's probably the highest level of ethics, which is just like this absurd thing that isn't like, that's not how consciousness works. It's just this bizarre thing. And you could say, no, it would end in this like utopia where it's like a hippie, but it's like, that's not what progressivism is. Progressivism is, even in that hippie utopian, space communism, there's still going to be something you're doing wrong. There's still going to be, but what about the robots? The robots need human rights too. Oh, the LLMs need human rights. It's like, anyway, that's progressivism at its extreme. But I don't know. Leftists aren't, I don't think they're that extreme in terms of progressives. They have their own religion that they're following right now. But anyway, like the point is, just don't be prideful. Because any kind of prideful chewing on the world leads to stupidity. Like you're not better than God. So like stop trying to be, and just try and be the best person that you can be. I don't know. That's probably a better plan than you got anyway. So it's like, well, just and you don't have an infinite amount of time to figure out what a better plan is. So it's like, is there something better we can figure out? Maybe there is. Maybe we should take all of the antithesis, like the complete antithesis of like this belief system, and try and scientifically validate it. Try and come up with something that can self-reinforce, that is both like non-fractal but fractal at the same time. And maybe it's possible. Maybe you need to leverage science to come up with like a competing counter-traditional, counter-human, world methodology, and maybe it'll work. But like, my point is, you would need to be very deliberate about that. And you would need to know what you're experimenting on, what you're trying to do. Because right now, all the atheists and all the science people and all the whatever, like all these kind of people on these weird prideful offshoots, they don't see their beliefs. They don't see what assumptions got them to where they're at. And they don't realize the weight of what they are actually doing, like what they're actually doing. Like if you guys were going to be honest with what you were doing, like you basically need to reinvent a type of religion, but like science-based. And the thing is, this was already tried. Robespierre tried this, I think, in the French Revolution. Like he created like this state religion of France, which is like the humanist religion or something. And it was like, anyway, obviously it flopped and it was stupid. But like, I mean, if you guys are going to be honest intellectually, you probably need to do something like that where it actually works. So anyway, but there's the positivistic way of invalidating everything I said. If you can do that, if you can come up with a better system than all of humanity has come up with, if that's possible, then I'm probably wrong. But if it's not possible, then I'm probably right. So get into your laboratories and make make the Antichrist religion. And yeah, let's see who wins in the end. But yeah. Anyway, hope you guys enjoyed. Follow me for more incoherent ramblings like this. But yeah, let me know what else I should talk about. But yeah, thanks for sticking around, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.